On this Friday the 13th, prepare for terrifying mysteries. From monstrous creatures in the New Mexico desert to the burning ghost haunting the West Virginia train tracks, and even the Jersey Devil stalking locals. Where are you watching from? What time is it for you? Stay with us, things only get more terrifying from here. And don't forget to subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. The Legend of the Slipmouth Woman. It was a quiet Friday the 13th in Tokyo, the streets bustling with their usual energy, but a sense of unease lingered in the air. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the narrow alleyways, three friends, Yuki, Haruto, and Aiko, made their way through the dimly lit streets after school. They had heard the stories, whispered among their classmates, about a mysterious woman who haunted the streets at night. It was said that she appeared out of nowhere, her face covered by a mask, only to reveal a horrifying secret beneath. Yuki, the most superstitious of the group, had warned them repeatedly to stay inside that night. Friday the 13th was cursed, she said, and the legend of Kukusekana, the Slipmouth Woman, was more than just a myth. But Haruto and Aiko had laughed it off, teasing her for being so scared of an old folktale. After all, they were in the heart of Tokyo, there were no ghosts here, only concrete and neon lights. As they wandered deeper into the city's older district, the streets became quieter, the bright lights of the main road fading into the distance. The buildings around them seemed to loom larger, casting long shadows over the group. Yuki couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something unseen lurking just out of view. Haruto, always the joker, suddenly stopped and turned to his friends with a grin. He mimicked the voice of the legend, asking, "Do you think I'm beautiful?" Yuki's heart skipped a beat as she glanced nervously at the alleyway behind them, but Haruto and Aiko burst into laughter, finding humor in the situation. Yuki forced a smile, but the unease in her stomach refused to fade. It wasn't until they reached a narrow side street, lined with old, abandoned shops, that things began to feel truly wrong. A figure stood at the far end of the street, tall and still, watching them. At first, Yuki thought it was just another pedestrian, but as they drew closer, she noticed the long black hair, the flowing coat, and the mask covering the woman's face. Her heart raced as the woman stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. Haruto, sensing Yuki's tension, gave her a playful shove and laughed, trying to lighten the mood. But Yuki couldn't take her eyes off the figure. The woman's eyes were dark and piercing, her presence unnerving. As they passed her, the woman's voice rang out softly, her words clear and sharp in the quiet night. The question came like a whisper, but it carried a weight that froze Yuki in place. Haruto and Aiko, still laughing, didn't notice at first, but Yuki's face paled as the woman's gaze locked onto her. The legend had come to life. Yuki's breath hitched as she stood frozen in place, her heart pounding in her chest. The woman, now only a few steps away, stood motionless, her mask gleaming faintly under the streetlights. Haruto and Aiko finally noticed Yuki's unease and turned toward the woman, their smiles fading as the atmosphere shifted into something far more sinister. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the night itself was closing in around them. Without warning, the woman stepped forward, her movements slow but deliberate, her eyes never leaving Yuki. Haruto, trying to break the tension, took a step toward her and asked if she needed any help, but the woman remained silent. Her hand rose to her face, fingers trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the mask. Yuki's pulse quickened, her instincts screaming for her to run. She had heard the stories, the warnings about the question this woman would ask, but none of it felt real until that moment. The legend of Kukusekana had always been something distant, a tale told to scare children, but now it was standing right in front of her. The woman's voice finally broke the silence, soft but chilling, as she asked, "Am I beautiful?" Yuki's stomach twisted as the question hung in the air. Haruto, ever the skeptic, rolled his eyes and laughed nervously, trying to shake off the creeping fear. He answered yes, not thinking twice about the consequences. Aiko, standing beside him, forced a smile, agreeing with him, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. The woman's hand moved again, this time pulling the mask from her face. The sight that greeted them was worse than Yuki could have imagined. The woman's mouth, once hidden, was grotesquely disfigured, a gaping slash stretching from ear to ear. Her teeth, sharp and glinting in the dim light, were bared in a twisted, unnatural grin. The wound was fresh, raw, as though it had only recently been inflicted. Blood glistened at the edges of the cut, and her eyes, once cold, now gleamed with an eerie satisfaction. Haruto and Aiko recoiled in horror, stumbling backward as the woman took another step forward. Yuki stood frozen, her legs refusing to move as the woman's gaze locked onto her. There was no escape. The legend had come to life, and now they were trapped in it. The woman's voice, now sharper and more sinister, cut through the night as she asked again, "Even now?" Aiko, trembling with fear, tried to answer, but her voice faltered. Haruto's bravado had vanished, his face pale as he took a step back, unable to respond. Yuki's heart raced, her mind scrambling for a way out, but the woman's eyes bore into hers, waiting for an answer. The terror of the situation sank in. If they said yes, they knew what would happen. If they said no, the outcome would be just as grim. The air felt heavy, thick with dread, as the woman stood over them, waiting. Yuki's mind raced as the woman's question echoed in her ears. Even now? The grotesque grin, stretching unnaturally across her face, was a sight she couldn't look away from. Haruto and Aiko were frozen in terror, unable to move, their eyes wide with horror. Every instinct screamed for them to run, but the fear had paralyzed them, trapping them in this nightmare. Haruto was the first to break. He bolted, turning on his heels and sprinting back the way they had come, his footsteps pounding against the pavement. Aiko followed suit, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she pushed her legs to move faster. Yuki hesitated for a split second, her mind clouded with panic, but the woman's piercing gaze snapped her back to reality. She couldn't stay here, she had to run. With a sharp intake of breath, Yuki tore her eyes away from the woman's disfigured face and took off after her friends. The alleyway seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the darkness swallowing the street as they ran. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound of her own breathing deafening in her ears. But no matter how fast they ran, Yuki couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was still behind them, watching, waiting. The city streets, once familiar, now seemed foreign and hostile. Every shadow seemed to move, every corner a potential hiding place for the slit-mouthed woman. Yuki's legs burned with the effort, but she forced herself to keep going. She could hear Haruto's ragged breathing ahead of her, but Aiko had fallen behind, her pace slowing as fear and exhaustion overtook her. Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the night. Yuki whipped her head around just in time to see Aiko stumble and fall, her body crumpling to the ground as she gasped for breath. Without thinking, Yuki turned back, rushing to her friend's side. Aiko's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror as she clutched Yuki's arm, struggling to stand. Behind them, the figure of Kukase Kana appeared, her silhouette tall and menacing in the dim light. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring their fear. Her long black hair swayed with each step, and her blood-stained smile gleamed in the darkness. The sight of her sent a fresh wave of terror through Yuki's veins, but she couldn't abandon Aiko. Haruto's voice called out from the distance, urging them to hurry. Yuki pulled Aiko to her feet, her hands trembling as she half-carried her friend down the alley. The woman was closing in, her footsteps slow and deliberate, the sound echoing eerily in the empty streets. They couldn't outrun her. Yuki knew that now. But they had to try. Just as they rounded a corner, the sound of the woman's voice rang out again, soft but unmistakable. "Am I still beautiful?" Yuki's heart sank. There was no escaping her. The legend was real, and now it was hunting them. Yuki's heart pounded in her chest as she and Aiko stumbled down the narrow street, the question still ringing in her ears. The woman's voice, cold and haunting, echoed in the air around them, as if the very night itself was closing in. Even now, the figure of Kukase Kana loomed behind them, her slow, deliberate steps never faltering, her grotesque smile gleaming in the dim light. Haruto was just ahead, frantically looking for a way out, but the alley they had turned down was a dead end. The realization hit them like a punch to the gut, there was no escape. trapped between the brick walls and the relentless spirit behind them, Yuki knew they had run out of time. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. Yuki turned to face the slit-mouthed woman, her hands trembling, her breath shallow. The air felt thick with fear, every instinct screaming at her to flee, but there was no point. The legend had come for them, and now they would have to face it. Kukase Kana stood at the mouth of the alley, her dark hair hanging in loose strands over her face. Her eyes glinted with a strange, twisted pleasure as she took another step forward, her long, blood-stained scissors glinting in her hand. The sight of the weapon sent a chill down Yuki's spine, and she instinctively backed up, pulling Aiko closer. "Am I still beautiful?" The question came again, and this time, Yuki knew there was no right answer. She had heard the stories, she knew the outcomes. If they said yes, the woman would carve their faces to match her own. If they said no, their fate would be just as grim. The legend was a trap, one they had walked right into. Haruto, his bravado long gone, tried to speak, his voice shaking as he stumbled over his words. But before he could finish, Kukase Kana moved. With terrifying speed, she lunged toward him, her scissors raised. The sound of metal slicing through the air was deafening, and Yuki's scream caught in her throat as she watched the horror unfold. Haruto barely had time to react before the woman's blade came down. He collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing in pain as the spirit's eyes locked onto Yuki and Aiko. The terror in the air was suffocating, and Yuki could feel the weight of the moment crushing her. There was no escape. Not from this. In a final act of desperation, Yuki did the only thing she could think of. She grabbed Aiko's hand and shouted the first thing that came to mind, a lie, a twist on the legend she hoped might confuse the spirit. "You're average," she yelled, her voice cracking with fear. For a split second, the slit-mouthed woman froze, her grotesque smile faltering. The answer was unexpected, a break from the pattern of the legend. For that brief moment, Yuki and Aiko took their chance, pushing past the spirit as she stood in stunned silence. They ran, their legs burning with the effort, the alley and the spirit disappearing behind them. As they fled into the night, Yuki couldn't shake the feeling that the legend wasn't finished with them. The slit-mouthed woman would return. And next time, there would be no escaping her. The 13th child, a dark curse. In the heart of the dense pine barrens of New Jersey, the woods held a secret that had been whispered about for centuries. The legend spoke of a creature born under a curse, one that had roamed the forests for over 200 years. Locals called it the Jersey Devil, a being of nightmares with bat-like wings, cloven hooves, and eyes that glowed in the darkness. It was said that the creature had been born on a stormy night in 1735, the cursed 13th child of a woman who had called upon dark forces in her anger. On this particular Friday the 13th, the air in the Pine Barrens felt unusually thick, the forest unnervingly quiet. Andrew, a lifelong resident of a nearby town, had always heard the stories but never believed them. He had grown up exploring the barrens, camping with his friends, and laughing at the old tales told by the older generation. Tonight, however, he would discover that some legends are rooted in a terrifying reality. Andrew had planned a weekend camping trip with his two closest friends, Nick and Sarah. The trio had ventured deep into the woods, far from any sign of civilization, setting up camp near a secluded clearing. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie light over the trees as they gathered around the fire, telling ghost stories to pass the time. As the fire crackled and the wind howled softly through the trees, a sense of unease began to settle over the group. Sarah, always the skeptic, laughed as Andrew tried to recount the tale of the Jersey Devil. She dismissed it as nonsense, just another urban legend designed to scare children. But as the night wore on, even she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The silence of the forest was too complete, the usual sounds of nocturnal animals eerily absent. It was Nick who first noticed the strange movement in the distance. The flicker of something large, dark, and fast darting between the trees. He squinted into the darkness, trying to make sense of what he had seen, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. His unease grew, but he said nothing, not wanting to alarm the others. But Andrew saw it too. The shape, barely visible in the dim light, seemed to hover just beyond the reach of the firelight. He stood up, peering into the forest, his heart racing. It couldn't be, no, it had to be a trick of the light. Yet, as he strained his ears, he thought he heard something. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, followed by the unmistakable flapping of wings. Before he could say anything, the wind picked up, blowing the flames of their campfire sideways. The shadows around them grew longer, and the sense of being watched intensified. Sarah, her skepticism now replaced by nervousness, glanced around the clearing, her eyes wide with fear. The night felt alive, as though the very forest itself was holding its breath. Andrew's voice was barely a whisper as he urged his friends to pack up. But as they scrambled to gather their things, a chilling cry echoed through the woods, unlike anything they had ever heard before. It was a high-pitched screech, almost inhuman, and it sent a wave of pure terror through their bones. The Jersey Devil was real. And it was coming for them. The screech echoed through the trees, sending shivers down Andrew's spine. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the straps of his backpack, urging Nick and Sarah to hurry. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard, an otherworldly cry that cut through the stillness of the night like a blade. The shadows seemed to thicken, pressing in around them as if the forest itself was closing off their escape. Nick, always the level-headed one, tried to rationalize what they had heard. "It's probably just an animal," he muttered under his breath, though even he didn't sound convinced. Sarah, on the other hand, was visibly shaken, her eyes darting nervously between the trees as she packed up her gear. The earlier bravado she had displayed was gone, replaced by the gnawing fear that something terrible was lurking in the darkness. They needed to leave, now. As they extinguished the fire, the forest grew even darker, the faint light of the moon their only guide. The trail back to the road was narrow, winding through the thick underbrush, and the sense of being watched never left them. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig made them jump, their hearts pounding in unison. Andrew led the way, his flashlight cutting a weak path through the shadows. Behind him, Sarah clutched her flashlight with white-knuckled hands, while Nick stayed close to the rear, constantly glancing over his shoulder. The wind had picked up, carrying with it a strange, acrid smell, like something burning in the distance. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from somewhere behind them, a tree branch snapping under the weight of something heavy. Andrew froze, his breath catching in his throat. His eyes met Nick's, the fear in both their faces unmistakable. Slowly, they turned, their flashlights sweeping over the dense trees. In the distance, just beyond the reach of the light, they saw it. A shape, massive and distorted, hovered in the shadows. It stood on two legs, but its body was twisted and wrong. Its wings, leathery and bat-like, spread wide as it moved, and its eyes glowed a deep, menacing red. Cloven hooves stamped into the dirt, and its long, pointed tail swayed behind it like a serpent. The Jersey Devil. It stared at them, motionless for a moment, as if studying its prey. Then, without warning, it screeched again, the sound piercing the night like a siren, and began to move toward them with terrifying speed. Andrew didn't need to say anything. In an instant, the three of them were running, their feet pounding against the forest floor as they sprinted down the narrow trail. The creature gave chase, its heavy footfalls echoing in the darkness, its wings flapping as it leapt from tree to tree with unnatural agility. Panic coursed through Andrew's veins as he pushed his legs to move faster, the branches tearing at his clothes and skin. He could hear Sarah's ragged breathing behind him, and Nick's shouts of panic as the creature gained on them. The trail ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, and the dense underbrush made every step feel like a battle. Andrew's heart pounded in his ears, drowning out the sounds of the forest, but the flapping of the Jersey Devil's wings was growing louder. Closer. They wouldn't make it. The creature was too fast, too relentless. But they had no choice. They had to keep running. Suddenly, Sarah stumbled, her foot catching on a root hidden beneath the leaves. She fell hard, the air knocked from her lungs as she hit the ground. Andrew skidded to a stop, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts as he turned to help her. But the Jersey Devil was closing in. Andrew's heart raced as he rushed to Sarah's side. She was gasping for breath, her eyes wide with panic as she struggled to get up. The Jersey Devil's screech echoed through the trees again, louder, closer, its presence pressing in like a wave of dread. The creature was nearly upon them, and Andrew knew they didn't have much time. Nick, now ahead of them, turned back, his face pale with terror. "We have to move," he shouted, but the urgency in his voice was drowned out by another ear-piercing screech from the beast. With a desperate burst of energy, Andrew grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her to her feet. She winced in pain but managed to stand, her legs trembling beneath her. There was no time to check for injuries. The only thing that mattered was escaping the creature that was bearing down on them. As they started running again, Andrew could feel the ground tremble beneath his feet. The Jersey Devil was charging, crashing through the trees with terrifying speed. Its red eyes burned through the darkness, locking onto its prey with unrelenting focus. Andrew could hear the heavy beat of its wings, the crunch of leaves and branches as it closed the distance. Then, in the dim glow of his flashlight, Andrew spotted something, a small wooden cabin nestled between the trees. The structure was old and weathered, its windows dark and cracked, but it was their only chance. Without thinking, Andrew shouted to Nick and Sarah, pointing toward the cabin as he veered off the trail. Nick followed without hesitation, his breath ragged as they sprinted toward the shelter. Sarah stumbled, her movements sluggish, but Andrew held her steady, dragging her along as they raced toward the cabin. The sound of the Jersey Devil's screech filled the air again, and Andrew felt a cold wave of terror wash over him. The beast was right behind them. They reached the cabin just as the creature burst through the trees, its massive form looming over them. Andrew didn't stop to look. He yanked the door open, practically throwing Sarah inside before diving in after her. Nick was right behind them, slamming the door shut with a loud bang. For a brief moment, the cabin fell silent. The air was thick with tension, the only sound the rapid pounding of their hearts as they tried to catch their breath. Outside, the Jersey Devil let out another blood-curdling screech, its wings beating against the ground as it circled the cabin, searching for a way in. Andrew's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. The cabin was small and dilapidated, its walls lined with old, rotting wood. The windows were cracked, barely holding together, and the door was flimsy at best. It wouldn't hold for long. Nick's voice broke the silence, a tremor of fear in his words as he whispered, "What do we do now?" Before Andrew could answer, the creature slammed into the side of the cabin, shaking the entire structure. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the windows rattled in their frames. The beast was relentless, clawing at the walls, its snarls echoing through the night. They could hear its hooves scraping against the ground, the heavy thud of its wings as it prepared to strike again. Panic surged through Andrew as he searched the room for something, anything, they could use to defend themselves. But the cabin was nearly empty, save for a few broken pieces of furniture and old, rusted tools that wouldn't stand a chance against the Jersey Devil. Another crash, and the door buckled under the force of the creature's attack. Andrew's breath caught in his throat as he backed away, pulling Sarah and Nick with him. The door wouldn't hold much longer. They were trapped. The cabin shook with each powerful strike from the Jersey Devil. The door, already splintering under the pressure, was only moments away from giving way entirely. Andrew's pulse raced as the reality of their situation sank in. They were trapped, with no weapons, no escape, and a creature from nightmares relentlessly trying to break in. Sarah, pale and trembling, clung to Andrew's arm, her eyes wide with terror. Nick stood frozen near the window, watching helplessly as the creature circled the cabin, its glowing red eyes flickering through the cracks in the walls. The sound of its hooves scraping against the ground sent chills down their spines. Another crash, and the door buckled inward, hanging on by just a sliver of wood. The creature let out a guttural roar, its claws scratching at the frame as it prepared for the final blow. The small space inside the cabin felt suffocating, the air thick with fear and desperation. Andrew's mind raced. There had to be something they could do, some way to slow the creature down, to give them even a moment to think. His eyes scanned the room again, landing on a heavy, rusted iron rod leaning against the far wall. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. With Without hesitating, Andrew grabbed the rod and positioned himself near the door. The others looked at him with uncertainty, but there was no time for second-guessing. He had to try something, anything, to keep the creature at bay. With a deafening crack, the door finally gave way, splintering into pieces as the Jersey Devil lunged into the cabin. Its massive form filled the entrance, its bat-like wings spread wide, its glowing eyes locked onto Andrew. The creature's breath was hot and foul, its sharp teeth gleaming in the dim light. Andrew swung the iron rod with all his strength, striking the creature across its snout. The Jersey Devil reared back, letting out a furious screech, but the blow only seemed to enrage it. The beast charged forward, its claws swiping through the air as Andrew stumbled back, narrowly avoiding its grasp. Nick, realizing they couldn't fight the creature head-on, shouted for Sarah and Andrew to move toward the back of the cabin. There had to be another way out, a window, an escape hatch, anything. They scrambled across the room, dodging the creature's attacks as it tore through the furniture, smashing everything in its path. At the back of the cabin, Sarah spotted a small window, just large enough for them to crawl through. Without thinking, she threw it open, the cold night air rushing in. Nick was the first to climb through, followed by Sarah. Andrew stayed behind, gripping the iron rod tightly as he faced the creature. The Jersey Devil let out a roar, its wings beating furiously as it prepared to strike again. But Andrew wasn't ready to give up just yet. With one final swing, he slammed the iron rod into the creature's side, sending it staggering back just long enough for him to make a break for the window. He squeezed through the narrow opening, landing hard on the ground outside. Behind him, the Jersey Devil's screech echoed through the woods as it thrashed about in the cabin, enraged but momentarily trapped inside. The three of them didn't waste a second. They ran, their legs burning as they sprinted through the trees, the terror of the night driving them forward. The sound of the Jersey Devil's cries faded into the distance, but the fear that it would come after them again never left. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of the forest, collapsing onto the grass, their hearts pounding. The silence of the night felt eerie, unnatural, as if the forest itself had been holding its breath. But they had survived. For now. Summoning Bloody Mary, real fear. It was a chilly Friday the 13th, and the atmosphere in the small town of Brookhaven was filled with an uneasy tension. Mia, Lucas, and Emma had gathered at Mia's house for what they thought would be a typical night of harmless dares and urban legends. The air outside was cold and crisp, with the autumn leaves swirling in the wind, but inside, the warmth of their laughter masked the creeping sense of dread that had begun to settle over the room. Mia, the boldest of the group, had always been fascinated by ghost stories. She had spent countless nights reading about famous urban legends, and one in particular had always intrigued her, the legend of Bloody Mary. It was said that if you stood in front of a mirror in a dark room and chanted her name 3 times, Bloody Mary would appear. The stories varied. Some claimed she would reveal the face of your future spouse, others said she would show you death. But the most terrifying version was the one where the bloody face of a malevolent spirit would appear, seeking vengeance. The room grew quieter as Mia suggested the idea. Lucas and Emma exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier playfulness fading into nervous tension. They had all heard the stories before, but none of them had ever dared to try it. Friday the 13th was notorious for bringing bad luck, and the thought of tempting fate on such a night sent chills down their spines. Lucas, ever the skeptic, tried to laugh it off. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but there was something about the legend that unsettled him. Mia, seeing the hesitation in his eyes, pressed forward, daring him to take part in the ritual. Emma, always cautious, stayed quiet, unsure if she wanted to go through with it. Mia stood up, her excitement growing, and walked toward the large mirror hanging on the wall near the hallway. The dim light from the nearby lamp cast eerie shadows across the room, giving everything a strange, surreal glow. She grabbed a candle from the table, lit it, and turned to face her friends. Her challenge was simple. One of them had to say the name Bloody Mary 3 times while looking into the mirror. The candle would be their only source of light. If nothing happened, they could laugh it off as just another silly story. But if the legend was real, well, that was a risk they were all too afraid to consider. Reluctantly, Lucas stood up, the weight of the dare settling over him. He took the candle from Mia, his fingers trembling slightly as he approached the mirror. The flickering flame cast his reflection in a distorted, wavering light, and for a moment, he could have sworn he saw something move in the background. Emma stood by, her heart pounding in her chest. She whispered a quiet protest, but Mia, eager for the thrill, waved her off. Lucas stared at his reflection, his throat dry, as he prepared to speak the name. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper, as the air around them thickened with anticipation. Lucas stood frozen in front of the mirror, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows across his face. His reflection stared back at him, distorted slightly by the wavering flame, but there was something else, something in the way the shadows moved, that made him feel as if he wasn't alone. The air was thick with tension, and the room seemed to hold its breath as Lucas prepared to speak. Mia stood just behind him, her excitement barely contained, while Emma hovered near the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her anxiety growing with each passing second. She had always been the cautious one, and now, standing in the dim light, she regretted going along with Mia's dare. Lucas took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. It's just a story, he reminded himself. There's no such thing as Bloody Mary. But as he stared into the depths of the mirror, the weight of the legend seemed to press down on him. The candle flickered again, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw something in the reflection, a faint movement in the shadows behind him. He quickly shook off the feeling and leaned closer to the mirror. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he spoke the name, Bloody Mary. The words seemed to hang in the air, echoing softly in the silence. Mia grinned, but Emma's face paled as she watched the scene unfold, her breath shallow and uneven. Bloody Mary, Lucas said again, his voice a bit louder this time. The room felt colder, the temperature dropping with each word. Emma took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest, while Mia leaned forward, her eyes wide with anticipation. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, as if something was stirring just beyond the edge of the candle's light. And then, for the third time, Lucas spoke the name. Bloody Mary. The moment the final word left his lips, the candle flickered violently, nearly going out. The room grew impossibly cold, and a strange, oppressive silence fell over them. Lucas stared into the mirror, his reflection barely visible in the dim light. For a moment, nothing happened. The tension in the air thickened as they waited, their eyes glued to the mirror. But then, slowly, the image in the glass began to change. Lucas blinked, his heart skipping a beat as his reflection distorted, the features on his face twisting into something unfamiliar. The shadows behind him seemed to grow, creeping closer until they formed the outline of a figure. At first, it was faint, barely more than a suggestion of movement, but as they watched in horror, the figure in the mirror became clearer. It was a woman. Her long, dark hair hung in tangled strands over her face, her skin pale and streaked with blood. Her eyes, hollow and sunken, stared back at Lucas through the glass, filled with a deep, unsettling malice. The corners of her mouth twisted into a sickening grin, her lips dripping with fresh blood. Lucas stumbled back, his heart racing as the woman in the mirror moved closer, her hand reaching out as if to touch him through the glass. Mia gasped, her excitement turning to fear as the figure's bloody face pressed against the surface of the mirror, her voice faint but chilling as it filled the room. Lucas felt a jolt of terror shoot through his body as the bloody face of the woman in the mirror pressed closer, her eyes boring into his with a terrifying intensity. Her lips, smeared with crimson, curved into a grotesque smile as she reached toward him, her bloodied hand seeming to stretch through the glass. The room was silent except for the faint, eerie whisper of her voice, chilling every bone in his body. Mia's excitement had evaporated, her face pale as she stared at the figure in the mirror. She had expected something spooky, a thrill of the supernatural, but not this. Not the cold, living presence that now occupied the reflection. Emma, trembling at the doorway, could hardly believe what she was seeing. Her logical mind raced for an explanation, but there was none. This wasn't a trick. This was real. Lucas tried to move, but his body felt frozen in place, as though the figure in the mirror had a hold on him. He wanted to scream, to call out for help, but the words stuck in his throat. His legs felt like lead, and the oppressive cold of the room only made it harder to think. The figure's hand pressed harder against the glass, her fingers leaving bloody streaks as they moved. The grin on her face widened, showing teeth stained with blood, and the light in the room seemed to dim further, casting everything in a shadowy haze. Her whisper grew louder, more insistent, though the words were impossible to make out. Mia, snapping out of her shock, reached for Lucas, her voice trembling as she called his name. She shook him, but he barely responded, his eyes locked on the terrifying face in the mirror. Emma, too frightened to move, watched helplessly from the doorway, her breath shallow and rapid. Suddenly, the woman in the mirror shifted. She wasn't just a reflection anymore. Her body seemed to push against the surface of the glass, distorting it as if the barrier between their world and hers was weakening. Lucas felt a strange pull, as though something was tugging him toward the mirror, drawing him closer to the figure inside. The cold intensified, and he could see his breath misting in the air. The woman's hand, still covered in blood, reached out again, but this time, it wasn't confined to the mirror. Slowly, impossibly, her fingers began to breach the surface of the glass. The smooth, reflective surface rippled like water, and her hand slipped through, reaching toward Lucas. Mia screamed, grabbing Lucas's arm and pulling him away from the mirror with all her strength. He stumbled backward, the pull of the mirror finally broken as he crashed to the floor, gasping for breath. The candle flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows on the walls, as the figure in the mirror slowly receded, her hand vanishing back into the glass. But her face remained, watching them with a twisted, blood-soaked smile. Her voice, though faint, echoed through the room as the light dimmed once more. The room felt impossibly cold as the figure of Bloody Mary lingered in the mirror, her bloodied face grinning menacingly at them. Mia clutched Lucas's arm, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Emma, still frozen at the doorway, stared in shock, unable to move, her mind reeling from the terror that had unfolded before her. Lucas lay on the floor, gasping for air, his eyes wide with fear. The woman's voice echoed faintly through the room, like a sinister whisper that clung to the very walls. Her presence felt suffocating, as though the air itself was filled with malice. The shadows in the room seemed to dance, flickering ominously as the candlelight grew weaker. "We need to get out of here," Mia finally managed to say, her voice barely more than a whisper. She pulled Lucas to his feet, her hands shaking as she glanced nervously at the mirror. Bloody Mary's eyes followed her every movement, the sinister grin never leaving her face. It was as if she was waiting for something they didn't understand. Emma, her voice trembling, whispered, "What if she follows us?" The question hung in the air, heavy with dread. None of them knew the answer. The legend never said what would happen after the summoning, but they had already gone further than anyone else had dared. The figure in the mirror had tried to cross into their world, and even now, her presence lingered just beyond the glass. Lucas, still disoriented, stumbled toward the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We need to leave. Now." Mia nodded, her pulse quickening as she grabbed the candle and moved toward the doorway. She avoided looking at the mirror, afraid that if she made eye contact with the figure again, she wouldn't be able to pull herself away. Emma followed close behind, her hands trembling as she clung to the last sliver of hope that they could escape. But as they reached the door, a loud crash echoed through the room. The mirror shook violently, the glass warping and distorting as if something was trying to break through. The candle flickered wildly, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. They turned back, their hearts pounding in terror, just in time to see the reflection of Bloody Mary start to move again. Her face twisted into something even more grotesque, the blood on her lips darkening as she pressed her hands against the glass. Her voice, once a faint whisper, now grew louder, more insistent. The glass cracked under the pressure, the sound sharp and piercing in the silence of the room. Mia's breath caught in her throat as she backed toward the door, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the candle. The figure in the mirror continued to push against the glass, her body distorting as if she was trying to force her way through. Then, in a final burst of light, the mirror shattered. The glass exploded outward, shards flying through the room as the candle was snuffed out, plunging them into darkness. Mia screamed, covering her face as the sharp fragments rained down around them. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the oppressive darkness closing in on all sides. When Mia finally opened her eyes, the room was still. The mirror, now broken, lay in pieces on the floor, and the figure of Bloody Mary was gone. But the sense of her presence remained, like a lingering shadow that refused to leave. The air felt thick with something unnatural, something that hadn't fully vanished. The three friends stood in the wreckage of the room, shaken and breathless. The terror of what they had just experienced would stay with them forever. They didn't speak as they left the house, the weight of the legend heavy in the air. But as they stepped into the cold night, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped after all. The memory of Bloody Mary's bloody smile haunted her, and deep down, she knew that some things were better left uninvoked. The beast of New Mexico strikes. In the heart of the New Mexico desert, where the heat pressed down on the land and the wind carried dust across the horizon, strange rumors had begun to circulate. Ranchers whispered about a beast that had been spotted near the outskirts of their properties. Livestock had been found drained of blood, their bodies left dry and lifeless under the hot sun. For weeks, the townsfolk had dismissed these stories as nothing more than wild tales, the stuff of legend, but now, fear was creeping into the conversations. Miguel had lived in these parts his entire life. The desert was his home, its wide, desolate expanses familiar to him in a way that city life could never be. He'd heard the stories before, about strange creatures lurking in the night, but he never believed them. The desert had its share of mysteries, but a monster? No, that was too far-fetched. It was a late Friday the 13th when Miguel received a call from his neighbor, Sophia. She sounded worried, her voice trembling as she explained that her cattle had been attacked. Several of them lay dead in the field, with no signs of struggle, just puncture wounds on their necks. It didn't make sense, there were no predators in this area capable of something like that. Miguel agreed to come over and take a look, though he wasn't expecting to find anything unusual. As he drove his old pickup truck across the barren landscape, the fading light cast long shadows over the sand, and an unsettling stillness hung in the air. The desert, usually alive with the sound of distant coyotes and the rustling of brush, was eerily silent. When he arrived at Sophia's ranch, the scene that greeted him was worse than he had imagined. 6 of her cattle lay sprawled across the dusty ground, their bodies unnaturally pale, their eyes wide open in death. The puncture wounds were unmistakable, 2 clean holes in each animal's neck, as if something had drained the life from them. Sophia stood nearby, her arms crossed, her face pale with fear. Miguel crouched down beside one of the carcasses, examining the wounds. There was no blood. It was as if the creature had simply taken it all, leaving behind only the empty husk of the animal. He felt a chill run down his spine despite the desert heat. This wasn't the work of coyotes or wolves. This was something far more sinister. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the desert in deep purples and reds, Miguel felt the weight of the silence pressing in. The desert, once a place of peace and solitude, now seemed dangerous, hiding something that shouldn't exist. Sophia whispered about the old legend, a monster that roamed the desert, a creature with glowing eyes and spikes down its back that could fly and drain the blood of its prey. Miguel wanted to laugh it off, but the sight before him made it hard to dismiss the idea entirely. Something was out there, and whatever it was, it had a taste for blood. Miguel couldn't shake the image of the cattle from his mind. The sight of those lifeless bodies, drained of blood, haunted him as he drove back home through the darkening desert. The sun had long since disappeared below the horizon, and the vast stretch of sand and rock was now cloaked in the deep blue of night. The headlights of his truck cut through the darkness, but beyond their reach, the desert seemed endless and unknowable. Sophia's words echoed in his mind, the legend of the desert beast, a creature with glowing eyes and spikes along its back, a monster that could fly and suck the blood of its prey. Miguel had grown up hearing those stories, but they had always been just that, stories. Now, though, with the gruesome scene he had witnessed, he couldn't dismiss the possibility that something unnatural was out there. The wind picked up, rattling the windows of the truck as he made his way down the narrow dirt road that led to his ranch. The desert was alive with shadows, shifting in the corners of his vision, making him jump at every movement. He cursed himself for letting the fear get to him. But as the truck rolled over a particularly rough patch of road, the engine sputtered and then went silent. Miguel's heart sank as the truck coasted to a stop. He turned the key in the ignition, but the engine only groaned in response. The headlights flickered once before going out completely, plunging him into total darkness. The only sound was the wind, now howling through the desert like a distant scream. For a long moment, Miguel sat there, gripping the steering wheel, his mind racing. He knew how to fix an engine. This wasn't the first time his old truck had broken down. But something about the silence, the oppressive blackness around him, made him hesitate. It felt like the desert was watching him, waiting. Finally, he grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the night. The beam of light pierced the darkness, illuminating the ground in front of him, but everything beyond the small circle of light remained hidden, impenetrable. Miguel moved to the front of the truck, popping the hood and shining the light on the engine. As he worked, a strange sound reached his ears. At first, it was faint, almost like the wind, but then it grew louder. It was a low, guttural growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath his feet. Miguel froze, his heart pounding. He slowly raised the flashlight, sweeping it across the desert, but there was nothing. Just sand, rocks, and the distant outline of the mountains. The growl came again, this time closer. Miguel turned in the direction of the sound, his pulse racing as the beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness. His hand shook, and for a split second, he thought he saw something, a large, hulking figure standing just at the edge of the light. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness, and its body, massive and covered in spikes, seemed to ripple with an unnatural energy. Miguel's breath caught in his throat as the figure moved. It didn't walk, it seemed to glide, its feet never touching the ground. The air around him grew colder, the wind dying down until there was nothing but silence. And then, with a sudden, terrifying speed, the creature lunged forward. Miguel's heart raced as the creature lunged at him from the darkness. In that split second, his body acted on instinct. He dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the beast's claws as they raked through the air where he had stood just moments before. The flashlight flew from his hand, landing several feet away, its beam casting long, erratic shadows across the desert floor. He hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from his lungs, but there was no time to recover. The creature's glowing eyes turned toward him, filled with a predatory hunger that chilled Miguel to the core. He scrambled to his feet, his body shaking with adrenaline, his mind screaming for him to run. But where could he go? The vast emptiness of the desert stretched out in every direction, offering no cover, no shelter. His truck, broken down and useless, sat nearby like a silent witness to the horror unfolding. The creature, massive and monstrous, was blocking his path back to the vehicle. As Miguel backed away, he caught his first real look at the beast. It was even larger than he had imagined, towering over him with a body that resembled a twisted, nightmarish version of a dog, but its features were far more grotesque. Its back was lined with sharp, bony spikes that glistened under the faint moonlight, and its wings, black and leathery, extended from its sides, twitching as if preparing to take flight. The air around it seemed to hum with energy, as though the beast wasn't entirely of this world. Miguel's legs felt weak, but he forced himself to keep moving. The creature let out a low growl, the sound vibrating through the ground beneath him. Its glowing eyes never left Miguel, tracking his every move with an unnerving precision. And then, without warning, it lunged again, this time faster, more determined. Miguel ran. His feet pounded against the sand, kicking up clouds of dust as he sprinted toward the only thing that came to mind, the hills in the distance. They were miles away, and he knew he couldn't outrun the beast, but his body moved on pure instinct. The sound of the creature's wings beating the air behind him filled him with a primal terror, the kind that told him he was running for his life. The desert stretched on endlessly, the dark shapes of cacti and rocks flying past as Miguel pushed his body to the limit. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he couldn't stop. Not now. not with the creature gaining on him. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his shoulder as something heavy and sharp grazed his back. He stumbled, nearly falling, but caught himself just in time. Glancing over his shoulder, he saw the beast's massive wings flapping above him, its claws swiping through the air, barely missing him. Its eyes blazed with fury, and its mouth, lined with sharp, jagged teeth, opened wide in a snarl. Miguel felt the weight of despair pressing down on him. He couldn't outrun this thing. It was faster, stronger, and more terrifying than anything he had ever encountered. And yet, the will to survive burned inside him. With one final burst of energy, Miguel veered to the right, heading toward a narrow ravine that cut through the desert floor. If he could reach it, maybe, just maybe, he could lose the creature in the tight, winding paths. The beast let out a furious roar as Miguel dove into the ravine, the walls closing in around him, offering a brief moment of shelter from the terror that followed. But he knew it wasn't over. The beast wasn't done with him yet. Miguel's body screamed in protest as he tumbled into the narrow ravine, his arms and legs scraping against the jagged rocks. He hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his side, but he barely had time to react before the sound of the beast's wings filled the air above him. The creature circled overhead, its glowing eyes scanning the ravine as it searched for its prey. Breathing heavily, Miguel pressed his body against the cold, rocky wall, trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but he knew this hiding spot wouldn't last long. The beast was relentless, and it wouldn't stop until it had him. The wind howled through the ravine, the darkness surrounding him like a suffocating blanket. Every second felt like an eternity as Miguel waited, barely daring to breathe. He could hear the heavy flapping of the creature's wings, the scrape of its claws against the rocks as it swooped low, scanning the ground for any sign of movement. Then, as if sensing its prey was near, the beast let out a deafening screech, the sound echoing through the narrow passage. Miguel flinched, his whole body tensing, but he forced himself to stay still. The glow of the creature's eyes cast an eerie light on the walls of the ravine as it passed overhead again, closer this time. Miguel's mind raced, searching for any way out. The ravine wasn't deep, but climbing out would expose him to the beast's claws. His only chance was to wait for an opportunity, to move when the creature was distracted, if that moment ever came. Suddenly, the flapping of wings grew more distant. The beast, for the moment, seemed to have lost track of him, and Miguel seized the chance. He moved cautiously, hugging the wall as he made his way deeper into the ravine. The path was treacherous, littered with loose rocks and sharp turns, but it offered a temporary shield from the creature's view. As he reached a bend in the ravine, Miguel spotted a narrow opening in the rock face ahead. It was small, barely wide enough for him to squeeze through, but it could be his only shot at survival. He didn't hesitate. Wincing from the pain in his shoulder, he scrambled toward the opening, slipping through just as the sound of the beast's wings grew louder again. Inside the crevice, the air was cold and damp, but it provided a sliver of safety. Miguel crouched in the darkness, his body trembling from the ordeal, listening intently as the beast circled the ravine once more. It let out another frustrated screech, its claws scraping against the rocks as it hunted for him. Minutes passed, each one dragging on longer than the last, but slowly, the sound of the creature's wings faded into the distance. The tension in Miguel's chest began to ease, though he knew he wasn't out of danger yet. He had to find a way back to the truck, and fast. With cautious steps, Miguel emerged from the crevice, his eyes scanning the sky for any sign of the beast. The desert was still and quiet, the stars overhead shining like distant beacons. Taking a deep breath, Miguel started his journey back, his body aching from the chase, but his resolve stronger than ever. The memory of the glowing eyes and the monstrous form of the creature would haunt him forever, but for now, he had survived. The desert held many secrets, but this night, Miguel had lived to tell the tale. Legend of the Burning Phantom. In the quiet, unassuming town of Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, the legend of Jenny's ghost was known by everyone. The B&O Railroad had long since faded into history, but the old tracks that cut through the edge of town remained a haunting reminder of a tragic past. Local residents spoke in hushed tones of a burning figure seen late at night along the tracks. Jenny, they said, her ghost doomed to walk the same path where she had met her fiery end. It had happened on a chilly autumn evening, decades ago. Jenny, a poor woman with no family, had lived a lonely life near the tracks, eking out an existence by scavenging what she could. On the night of her death, she had been sitting by a small campfire, warming up a bowl of broth to stave off the evening cold. But a single spark from the fire changed everything. It landed on her dress, igniting the fabric in an instant. Panic gripped her as the flames spread, engulfing her in seconds. Jenny's screams echoed through the empty woods as she desperately tried to extinguish the fire. In her frantic state, she stumbled toward the nearby train tracks, hoping to flag down the approaching train for help. But her efforts were in vain. As the fire consumed her, she fell onto the tracks, too weak to escape. The train, unable to stop in time, hit her, sealing her tragic fate. In the years since her death, strange occurrences had been reported near the tracks. Some claimed to hear distant screams carried on the wind late at night, while others swore they had seen a figure engulfed in flames walking along the tracks, vanishing just as quickly as it appeared. The locals had come to believe that Jenny's spirit was forever tied to the spot where she had perished. For years, the stories had been little more than local folklore, a tale to scare children or spook newcomers to the town. But there were always those who were curious, who wanted to test the legend for themselves. It was said that if you walked the tracks at midnight on the anniversary of Jenny's death, you might just catch a glimpse of her burning ghost. It was this curiosity that brought Ethan, a young man from the nearby city, to Harper's Ferry. He had always been fascinated by ghost stories, and when he heard about the legend of Jenny's ghost, he couldn't resist. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and his phone, Ethan made his way to the old tracks on the night of October 13th, the anniversary of her death. The night was still, the air heavy with the weight of superstition. As he walked along the tracks, the sound of his footsteps echoed in the quiet. The trees that lined the path seemed to close in on him, their branches casting eerie shadows in the pale moonlight. Ethan had never been one to believe in ghosts, but there was something unsettling about the silence that surrounded him. As the minutes ticked closer to midnight, Ethan's nerves began to fray. He had come here to prove that the legend was just a story, but now, standing alone on the darkened tracks, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. As midnight approached, the air around Ethan seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping rapidly despite the stillness of the night. His footsteps slowed as he neared the center of the old tracks, the beams of his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows over the rusted rails. The legend of Jenny had always been just a story to him, a tale to thrill and spook, but now, standing in the very place where she had met her tragic end, he felt a growing unease. The wind stirred lightly, whispering through the trees, but it carried with it an unsettling silence. There were no sounds of wildlife, no rustling of leaves, just the quiet that felt too heavy, too deliberate. Ethan's nerves were frayed, and despite his best efforts to stay calm, a creeping sense of dread began to take hold. As the clock struck midnight, a faint sound caught his ear. At first, it was barely noticeable, like a distant hum carried by the wind. But then, it grew louder, an unmistakable, haunting sound, the echo of a woman's scream. It wasn't the kind of scream born of anger or frustration, it was filled with pain and terror, the sound of someone who knew their end was near. Ethan froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. He swept the beam across the tracks, searching for the source of the sound, but there was nothing, only the empty tracks stretching out into the darkness. Yet, the scream persisted, growing louder, more urgent, as if it were coming closer. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back, every instinct telling him to run. But before he could move, something caught his eye. At the far end of the tracks, a faint light flickered, barely visible through the trees. It was small at first, a tiny glow that seemed to dance in the wind. But as Ethan stared, the light grew brighter, more intense, and it was moving toward him. The light flickered again, and for a brief moment, Ethan saw her. A figure, engulfed in flames, walking slowly down the tracks. Her form was hazy, distorted by the fire that consumed her, but there was no mistaking what he was seeing. The flames licked at her dress, her hair, her skin, but she kept moving, her steps slow and deliberate, as if she were reliving the final moments of her life. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he watched her. The burning figure moved closer, her face obscured by the flames, but her presence was undeniable. This was Jenny. The legend was real. Panic surged through him as the ghostly figure drew nearer. Her burning form illuminated the tracks, casting long shadows in every direction. The air around him grew thick with the smell of smoke, and the oppressive heat pressed down on him despite the coolness of the night. Ethan took a step back, his mind racing. This couldn't be happening. It was just a story. How could she be real? But the ghostly figure kept coming, her burning eyes fixed on him, her screams echoing in his ears. Ethan's heart raced as Jenny's burning ghost continued to move toward him, the flames licking at the air, casting a terrifying glow across the tracks. His legs felt weak, rooted to the spot as he watched her advance. Each step she took seemed slower, more deliberate, as though she was drawing out the moment, her burning eyes locked on his. The heat became unbearable as she neared, the air around him thick with the acrid smell of smoke. The sensation was suffocating, pressing down on him with a force that made it hard to breathe. Sweat trickled down his face as he tried to move, his body frozen in fear. His mind screamed at him to run, but his feet refused to obey. Her screams grew louder, more piercing, filling the night with a sound so full of pain and agony that it sent shivers down his spine. The very air around him seemed to vibrate with the weight of her torment, her fiery form flickering like a candle caught in the wind. Suddenly, the flames surrounding her began to change. What had once been a simple glow now burned brighter, hotter, until the flames enveloped her entire body. Her outline became more defined, and for the first time, Ethan could see her face. It was a face twisted in pain, her mouth open in a never-ending scream, her eyes hollow and glowing with an unnatural fire. Her dress, charred and blackened by the flames, clung to her ghostly form, and her outstretched hands, burned and twisted, seemed to reach for him. It was then that Ethan's survival instincts finally kicked in. He stumbled backward, his legs unsteady as he fought to get away. His breath came in ragged gasps, the weight of terror heavy in his chest. But no matter how fast he moved, the burning ghost of Jenny followed. The night around him seemed to warp, the once familiar landscape of the tracks and trees blurring as he fled. His flashlight, still clutched tightly in his hand, flickered weakly, casting erratic beams of light that did little to pierce the oppressive darkness. But it didn't matter. He couldn't outrun her. The ghostly flames danced closer, licking at his heels, and Ethan could feel the heat growing stronger. His legs burned from the effort of running, but his panic-fueled adrenaline kept him moving. He needed to get away, he needed to escape her fiery wrath. As he glanced over his shoulder, he saw her again. She was almost upon him now, her burning form floating just inches above the tracks, her face twisted in agony and fury. Her screams pierced the air like a physical force, making his heart hammer in his chest. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The flames flickered and vanished, leaving nothing but darkness in their wake. The oppressive heat dissipated, replaced by the cool night air. Jenny's ghostly form was gone, and the tracks were silent once more. Ethan stumbled to a halt, his legs shaking, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. He was alone again, the only sound the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. But the memory of her burning eyes and her agonized screams still lingered in his mind, haunting him in the silence. Ethan stood frozen on the tracks, his legs trembling beneath him as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. The air had returned to its cool, crisp state, the oppressive heat and flames gone as if they had never been there. But the memory of Jenny's burning ghost was seared into his mind. Her fiery eyes, her tortured screams, and the pain etched into her ghostly face, they were all too real. The night was still, eerily quiet after the chaos of moments before. The flashlight in Ethan's hand flickered weakly, casting small beams of light on the tracks where the ghost had walked. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart still racing from the terror of the encounter. He wanted to leave, to run as far away from these cursed tracks as possible, but his legs refused to move. He glanced around, half expecting Jenny to reappear, her burning form rising from the darkness to haunt him again. But there was nothing, only the quiet whisper of the wind through the trees and the distant sound of the river flowing in the background. The tracks stretched on into the blackness, empty and silent, as if the ghostly apparition had never existed. Ethan knew he couldn't stay there any longer. He had seen enough. Whatever had drawn him to these tracks, whatever curiosity had led him to test the legend, had been answered. The stories were true. Jenny's ghost walked the tracks, and her spirit was far more vengeful and tormented than any of the tales had suggested. As he slowly backed away, his footsteps soft on the gravel, a sudden thought struck him. What if Jenny wasn't done with him? What if her ghost could follow him beyond the tracks, haunting him wherever he went? The very idea sent a new wave of fear through his body. He couldn't escape her. He turned, quickening his pace as he made his way back toward the town, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the ghostly flames. Every shadow seemed to move, every gust of wind carried the faintest echo of her scream, and the fear of what might still be out there drove him to move faster. As he neared the edge of the tracks, the safety of the town in sight, something stopped him in his tracks. A faint glow flickered in the distance, right where he had been standing only moments ago. The light grew brighter, just for a second, and in that brief moment, Ethan swore he saw her again, Jenny, standing on the tracks, her body engulfed in flames, watching him as he fled. Her presence was unmistakable, and though she didn't move, her burning eyes followed him, as if warning him that this wasn't over. That she would be back. That the legend of Jenny's ghost would live on, and those who dared to walk the tracks would never truly be free of her haunting gaze. Ethan didn't stop until he reached the safety of the town, his mind racing with what he had seen. He knew he could never speak of it, no one would believe him. But deep down, he knew the truth. The ghost of Jenny haunted the tracks, and she would continue to do so, forever bound to the place where she had met her tragic, fiery end. And on every anniversary of her death, the burning ghost of Jenny would return, her screams echoing through the night, waiting for those brave, or foolish, enough to face her. As we reach the end of these spine-chilling tales, I have to ask, which story haunted you the most? Was it the burning ghost of Jenny, the relentless Jersey Devil, or the monstrous creature lurking in the deserts of New Mexico? Each legend holds its own dark mystery, but I'd love to hear which one sent the biggest shiver down your spine. And speaking of chills, do you have a personal paranormal experience or terrifying tale you'd like to share with us? We're always eager to hear your stories. Maybe your story could inspire the next video. Don't forget, the mysteries don't end here. There are plenty more stories on this channel, each one waiting to reveal its own dark secrets. So, if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and explore the rest of our haunted collection. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe, it's how you'll stay up to date with the most bone-chilling content. What would you like to see in our next video? Your suggestions are always welcome, and I'm sure we can uncover even more mysteries together. Until then, thank you for watching, and remember, there's always more to fear in the unknown.